All right, so let's jump into it. Today, we're going to be taking a look at Punjab and Sind Bank.
Okay.
And specifically, we're going to be looking at their Q3 FY25 results, which just came out on January 15, 2025.
Sounds good.
So we're really trying to go a little bit deeper here than just sort of the headlines that you might see,
Right.
in the news or kind of surface level understanding.
Hmm.
We really want to understand what these numbers tell us about the bank's future.
Absolutely. And I think, financial statements can be a little bit daunting for some people,
Yeah.
um, but they're really like a treasure map.
Oh,
They have all these clues, and if you know how to read them, then you can really unlock some valuable insights.
I like that analogy.
Yeah.
So let's start with the big picture. How did Punjab and Sind Bank perform in Q3?
Well, at first glance, they've shown some pretty impressive profit growth.
Okay.
They're reporting a net profit of 2819.6 lakhs for Q3 FY25.
Okay, and that's a pretty big jump from the previous quarter, right?
Yeah, it's significantly higher than the Rs 2395.9 lakhs they reported in Q2 FY25.
Okay.
And it's more than double their profit from the same period last year, Q3 FY24, when they reported Rs full man 1143.1 lakhs.
Wow. Okay, so yeah, that's a significant increase.
It is, and I think what's really interesting is to understand what's driving this growth.
Yeah, like what are the factors that are contributing to this positive performance?
Right. Well, it seems to be a combination of things.
Okay.
For one, they've seen some good growth in their core lending business.
So they're making money from the loans that they're giving out.
Exactly. And they've also made some strategic adjustments to their investment portfolio, which we'll talk about a little bit later.
Okay.
But those adjustments seem to be paying off.
Okay.
And it looks like they've been keeping a close eye on their expenses as well.
So it's a mix of, smart moves and just good financial management.
Exactly.
Okay, that sounds promising, but what about asset quality? I know NPAs or non-performing assets can be kind of a red flag for banks.
Yeah, that's a good point. Their gross NPAs currently stand at 3.83%,
Okay.
and net NPAs at 1.25%.
Oh, right.
Now, these figures have actually increased slightly compared to the last quarter.
Oh, okay.
But I think it's important to look at this in the context of the broader economic environment.
Yeah, right. The economy has been a little bit unpredictable lately.
Exactly.
So speaking of changes, though, I noticed in the report that there's been a big shift in how they're classifying their investments.
Right.
And it had something to do with the RBI, is that right?
Yeah, you're exactly right. So on April 1st, 2024, the Reserve Bank of India, they introduced a new framework
Okay.
for how banks categorize and value their investments.
Okay, so it's kind of like, I don't know if this analogy works, but it's like reorganizing your bookshelves.
Yeah,
Everything's still there, but it's just arranged a little bit differently.
exactly. It's just a different way of looking at things.
Okay, so how did this new system affect Punjab and Sind Bank's, bottom line? Did it
Yeah.
cause any major changes?
Well, it did lead to a pretty substantial adjustment
Okay.
to their general reserve
Fine, Gates.
of 4,249.54 crore.
Okay, that's a big number.
It is a large number, but it's
Mhm.
important to remember that this was an adjustment that they had to make to align with the RBI's new guidelines.
Okay.
It doesn't necessarily reflect any actual losses.
Okay, so it's more of a technicality than a cause for concern.
Precisely.
Okay.
And actually, what's interesting is that even with this change, they still saw an increase in their income from investments during the quarter.
Oh, okay.
And they also had some shifts in their AFS reserve.
And remind me, what is the AFS reserve again?
So the AFS reserve, it stands for available for sale.
Okay.
And it's basically a reserve that banks maintain to account for fluctuations
Oh, okay.
in the value of certain investments that they hold.
So it's kind of like a buffer against market volatility.
Exactly.
Okay, so that's good to have.
Yeah, definitely.
Now, something else that caught my eye in the report was a note that was labeled emphasis of matter, and it was regarding family pensions.
Yeah. What's the story there?
So this is basically related to how banks are managing
Okay.
the potential increase in pension liabilities
Okay.
due to some changes in family pension plans.
Okay.
And the RBI actually gave banks the option to spread out or amortize this cost
Okay.
over a certain period of time.
All right.
And Punjab and Sind Bank chose to do so.
Okay. So instead of taking like one big hit to their profits all at once,
All right.
they're gradually accounting for this pension obligation over time.
Exactly.
Okay. And does that affect their reported net profit?
It does. It affects the reported net profit for both the quarter and the 9 months leading up to it.
Okay.
But it's important to note that if they hadn't opted for this approach, their reported profit would have actually been lower.
Oh, okay. So it's more about presenting a clearer picture of their financial health over the long term
Exactly.
than trying to like hide anything or manipulate the numbers or something
Right. It's all about transparency and providing investors with a realistic view.
of their financial performance.
Good transparency is always good.
Definitely.
Um, we can't talk about this without acknowledging that, the elephant in the room, which is the after effects of the COVID-19 pandemic.
Right.
Did we see any signs of that lingering in Punjab and Sind Bank's Q3 results?
Well, yeah, I think we did. If you remember, the RBI introduced those Resolution Frameworks 2.0,
Yes.
which were designed to help businesses that were struggling because of the pandemic.
Right.
And if we look at the report, the number of accounts that have been restructured under these frameworks has actually decreased compared to last year.
Oh, so that's a good sign, right? That means that, things are kind of getting back to normal.
Yeah, I think it's a positive indicator that those pandemic-related pressures are easing.
Okay.
But of course, we have to remember that the economic recovery isn't uniform.
Right. Different sectors are going to be, recovering at different speeds.
Exactly.
Okay, so now let's move on to a topic that's always a little bit sensitive, which is fraud.
Right.
The report mentioned that Punjab and Sind Bank reported a number of fraud cases this quarter.
Yes, they reported 10 instances of what they classify as borrower frauds,
Okay.
totaling Rs 264.79 crore.
All right, and they set aside funds to cover this, right?
Yeah, absolutely. They made a full provision for that amount,
Okay.
meaning that they've allocated funds to cover any potential losses from those frauds.
Okay, and did they report these cases to the appropriate authorities?
Yes, they did. They reported them to the Reserve Bank of India, which I think is a good sign of transparency.
Right, transparency is super important, especially when it comes to banking.
Absolutely.
Okay, so let's shift gears a little bit and talk about an area where Punjab and Sind Bank seems to be really making a push, and that's digital banking.
Yeah, they've been investing a lot in that area.
Yeah, so tell me about what they're doing.
Well, for one thing, they've established what are called digital banking units, or DBUs,
Okay.
and they've done this following guidelines from the RBI. And these units are basically all about offering banking services through digital channels.
So it's like bringing the bank to your fingertips.
Exactly. You can do pretty much all of your banking from your phone or computer.
Okay.
And what's interesting is that there's now a new requirement for banks to report digital banking as a separate segment within retail banking.
Okay.
So this gives us a much clearer picture of how their digital banking operations are performing.
I'm sensing a theme here. There's lots of changes happening in the banking industry driven by these new regulations.
Yeah, definitely.
But it seems like they're all aimed at, greater transparency and making sure that investors and the public have a really clear understanding of what's going on.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment.
Okay, so before we move on, I want to get your take on their overall financial performance and growth. What really stands out to you?
I think their revenue growth is quite impressive.
Okay.
They've seen a solid increase in both interest income,
Okay.
which is the money they earn from lending,
Right.
as
Yeah.
well as other sources of income.
Okay. And what do you think is fueling this growth?
Well, that's probably a combination of factors.
Okay.
It could be things like strategic loan growth,
Hmm.
making sure that they're lending to the right customers.
Right.
It could also be that they're managing interest rate fluctuations well,
Oh, okay.
or maybe they've been successful in rolling out some new products or services.
And what about their cost management? Are they keeping their costs under control?
Well, that's where we look at something called the cost-to-income ratio,
Okay.
which basically tells us how much they're spending to generate every unit of income.
Right. So the lower the ratio, the better.
Exactly.
Okay. Speaking of things to keep an eye on, the report had a section for investors.
Right.
Anything particularly noteworthy in there?
Yeah, a couple of things.
Okay.
First of all, they've been actively raising capital.
Okay.
They recently secured 3,000 crore through long-term infrastructure bonds.
Wow. So they're really, planning for the future and investing in growth.
Absolutely.
Okay. Anything else?
Yeah, they've also been investing in something called priority sector lending certificates, or PSLCs.
Okay. And remind me what those are again?
So these are a way for banks to fulfill their obligation to lend to certain sectors
Okay.
that are considered crucial for the country's development, like agriculture, for example.
Okay, so it's a way for them to contribute to economic development while also, meeting the regulatory requirements.
Exactly.
Okay, and I noticed one other interesting tidbit in the report, which is that they had 0 investor complaints this quarter.
Yeah, that's definitely a positive sign.
Yeah, it seems like they're doing a good job of keeping their investors happy.
Seems like it.
Okay, so before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'm curious to get your overall take on Punjab and Sind Bank's future prospects for the rest of FY25.
Sure.
What's your outlook? Are they, on track for continued growth, or are there some potential challenges on the horizon?
Well, predicting the future is always a little bit risky, especially in the world of
For
finance.
sure.
But based on what we've seen so far and taking into account the current economic climate,
Hmm.
I think they're well positioned for continued growth.
Okay, that's good to hear.
Yeah, they've got strong profitability, they've been actively raising capital, and they're making a strategic push into digital banking. So,
Right. All good signs.
yeah. But of course, we have to remember that there are always risks
Right.
in any business.
Of course.
And the banking sector is particularly vulnerable to things like changes in interest rates,
Yeah.
economic downturns and changes in regulatory policies.
So you're saying it's important for investors to be aware of those risks.
Absolutely.
Okay. Now, I know we don't have the data on hand right now,
Right.
but I'm curious how Punjab and Sind Bank's Q3 performance compares to their competitors in the banking sector.
Yeah, that's a great question.
Are they outperforming the industry average or are they lagging behind?
Yeah, I mean, benchmarking their performance against their peers is really essential for understanding their competitive position. But unfortunately, the documents that we have don't provide that comparative data.
Okay, well, maybe that's something we can look into
Yeah,
in a future deep dive.
absolutely.
All right, so let's take a moment to just recap what we've learned so far
That's good.
about Punjab and Sind Bank's Q3 FY25 performance.
Okay.
We've seen some really strong profit growth.
We have.
We've talked about some interesting changes to their investment portfolio,
Right?
as a result of those new RBI regulations.
Mm-hmm.
We've discussed the impact of the COVID-19 resolution frameworks,
Yeah,
and we've also touched on the importance of transparency when it comes to things like fraud reporting.
definitely.
So before we move on, I want to leave our listeners with a thought-provoking question.
Okay. Okay.
How might Punjab and Sind Bank's strategic focus on digital banking influence its future financial performance and competitive position in the banking industry as a whole?
That's a really good question.
Mhm.
It really makes you think about how the banking industry is changing.
It is. And how companies like Punjab and Sind Bank are adapting to this new digital world.
Exactly. It's a really dynamic landscape. And I think those banks that embrace innovation and customer-centric digital solutions are the ones that are going to come out on top.
I agree. All right, well, we're going to take a quick break, but we'll be back in just a moment to continue our deep dive into Punjab and Sind Bank.
Sounds good. It's really fascinating to see how Punjab and Sind Bank is adapting and evolving in this rapidly changing financial landscape. And, you raised a really important point earlier about comparing their performance to their competitors.
Right. Like, where do they actually stand in the banking industry? Are they a leader? Are they playing catch up? Or are they somewhere in between?
Yeah, and even without having specific data on their competitors, I think we can still get some insights by looking at overall industry trends
Okay.
and the performance of similar banks. For instance, we know that the banking sector as a whole has witnessed a surge in digital transactions and mobile banking adoption.
It seems like everyone's managing their money from their smartphones these days.
Exactly. And so if Punjab and Sind Bank is really investing heavily in their digital infrastructure and expanding their digital offerings, then they're likely positioning themselves to capture a larger share of this growing market.
So they're not just keeping up with the times. They're trying to be ahead of the curve.
Exactly.
Okay.
And another key aspect to consider is the overall economic climate.
Mm-hmm.
Interest rates have been on an upward trajectory lately,
Okay.
and this can have a direct impact on a bank's profitability.
How so?
Well, when interest rates rise, banks can generally charge higher interest rates on loans,
Okay.
which boosts their income.
Right.
But on the other hand, they also have to pay higher interest rates on deposits,
Okay.
which increases their expenses.
So it's a bit of a balancing act.
It is, and their ability to manage this balance will significantly influence their net interest margin, which is a key indicator of profitability.
Okay, so even without specific data on their competitors, by analyzing these broader economic factors and industry trends, we can start to understand how Punjab and Sind Bank might be positioned.
Absolutely. And it's important to remember that, financial performance is just one piece of the puzzle.
Right.
There are also these other qualitative factors to consider, like the bank's management team, their risk appetite, their brand reputation, the quality of their customer service.
Yeah, you're right. Numbers don't always tell the whole story.
Exactly. It's about understanding the complete picture.
Well, I think we've done a pretty good job of that today. We've looked at their financials, their strategic initiatives, their risk management practices, and even their place within the wider industry.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground. Hopefully our listeners walking away with a much clearer understanding of not just Punjab and Sind Bank, but the inner workings of the banking sector in general.
Yeah, that's what these deep dives are all about. We want to empower you with the knowledge and insights to make informed decisions, whether you're an investor or a customer or just someone who's curious about the world of finance.
And who knows, maybe our conversation today has even sparked some ideas for your own financial journey.
I hope so, because knowledge is power. The more informed you are, the better equipped you are to navigate the complexities of the financial world.
Right now, before we wrap up completely, I'm curious to get your take on something we haven't really touched on yet, and that's the bank's commitment to social responsibility and sustainability.
That's a great point. It's a really important aspect for any company these days. Did you notice anything in the report that spoke to their efforts in this area?
Well, they did mention purchasing those priority sector lending
Oh,
certificates,
right.
which shows they're contributing to the growth of those sectors that are considered essential for the country's development.
Yeah, for sure. That definitely falls under that umbrella of social responsibility. But what about environmental sustainability? Are they taking any steps to minimize their environmental impact or promote any green initiatives?
That's a really good question, and unfortunately, the report doesn't really provide much detail on that. It might be worth exploring their website or other public disclosures to get a better sense of their environmental commitments.
Yeah, good idea. It's always interesting to see how companies are balancing, their financial goals with their social and environmental responsibilities.
Hmm.
It's not always easy to find that balance, but it's becoming increasingly important for long-term success.
I completely agree. Consumers are becoming more discerning and they want to support businesses that align with their values.
Yeah,
So transparency and genuine efforts towards sustainability are no longer optional, they're essential.
couldn't agree more.
Yeah.
Well, I think it's time to move on to the last part of our deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground already.
Yeah, before we do that, though, I'd like to leave our listener with one final thought to ponder.
Ooh, I like that. What's the question?
As technology continues to revolutionize the financial landscape, what skills and knowledge will individuals need to thrive in this new world?
Wow, that's a deep one. It really makes you think about the future of work and the importance of lifelong learning and how we can all adapt to this, the rapid pace of technological change.
Exactly. Because whether we like it or not, the world is changing, and those who embrace those changes and equip themselves with the skills of the future will be the ones who succeed.
Couldn't have said it better myself. We'll leave our listener to ponder that question as we move on to wrap things up and maybe explore that thought-provoking question in a little more detail. We've covered a lot of ground, talking about the bank's performance, all the economic factors, and even their efforts in social responsibility, but sometimes it's easy to lose sight of the human element in all of this.
It's true. Sometimes you have to zoom out and remember that behind all those financial statements are real people whose lives are impacted by these changes.
Absolutely. So let's bring it down to earth for a second. Imagine you're a customer of Punjab and Sind Bank. How do these digital banking initiatives that we talked about, how do they actually change your everyday banking experience?
Well, I think the biggest thing is convenience.
Okay.
Instead of having to rush to a branch during their limited business hours,
Yeah.
you can manage your money anytime, anywhere, right from your phone or computer.
It really is like having a bank in your pocket these days.
Exactly. You can check your balance, transfer funds, pay bills, even apply for loans,
Wow.
all with a few taps on your screen. It's a game changer for people who have busy lives,
Yeah.
or maybe people who have difficulty getting to a physical branch.
Okay, so that's great for people who are comfortable with technology.
Right.
But what about those who aren't? Are they being left behind?
Well, that's where those digital banking units that we mentioned earlier come in.
Okay.
They can act as a bridge, offering personalized support and guidance to help people navigate the digital world.
Hmm.
No one should be excluded from the benefits of these advancements just because they're not as tech savvy.
I like that, it's important that everyone has equal access to these tools. When we were discussing those priority sector lending certificates earlier,
Right.
it reminded me that banking isn't just about profits, it's also about supporting economic development.
Yeah, absolutely. By providing access to credit and financial services,
Hmm.
especially in rural areas, banks can really fuel entrepreneurship,
Hmm.
support agriculture and contribute to the overall prosperity of the community.
It's like a ripple effect, creating opportunities and empowering people to build a better future for themselves.
Exactly. And it aligns with those broader national goals
Mhm.
for, economic growth and development.
So we've touched on a lot of different things, but I keep coming back to that thought-provoking question that you posed earlier
Oh, yeah.
about, as technology transforms the financial landscape, what skills do people need to thrive in this new world?
It's a really big question, and I don't think there's any one right answer. But I think there are a few key areas that stand out.
Okay, I'm ready. Lay it on me.
Well, I think first and foremost, digital literacy is going to be essential.
Okay.
It's not just about knowing how to use a specific app. It's about understanding how technology works,
Right.
its possibilities, its limitations.
It's like you need a digital compass to navigate this ever-changing landscape.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
alongside that, financial literacy is going to be crucial. You know,
Yeah.
people need to be equipped to manage their money,
Yeah.
make smart investments, and protect themselves from financial risks.
Especially with all the options out there these days, online banking, cryptocurrency, all these new investment opportunities can feel really overwhelming.
It can. And that's why it's so important to empower yourself with knowledge. You know,
Mm.
seek out reliable sources of information.
So are there resources available to help people with that?
Absolutely. There are tons of resources out there.
Yeah.
Online courses, workshops, books, financial advisors.
Okay.
The key is to be proactive and find reputable sources.
It all comes back to that idea of lifelong learning, doesn't it?
Exactly. The
Yeah.
skills we learn today might be outdated tomorrow. Being
Yeah.
able to adapt, learn new things, and constantly grow will be essential for navigating the future.
The only constant is change.
Right.
And those who embrace change are the ones who will thrive.
Well said.
Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into Punjab and Sind Bank.
We have.
We've explored their performance, their strategy, and the broader forces shaping the financial landscape.
Yeah, I think our listeners are walking away with a much better understanding of the banking industry and how it's evolving.
I hope so too. And I also hope they feel empowered to keep learning and keep exploring the world of finance.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us today, and we'll see you next time for another deep dive.
Sounds good.